Hello again, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of, well, not Freeform Friday, but Freeform Wednesday, my dudes and dudettes. On this Wednesday, March the 4th, 2026. We've been looking to do this episode for about a month almost. Allan and I have talked about it, and couple things have come up on both our ends, and we were unable to do it. And here we are. So we are just waiting for Allan to join so we can get things started. What's going on, everybody? Hope you're all doing well. Hope all is well with each and every one of you. We're halfway there. Another week almost over. And we've got a lot of topics to discuss this week when it comes to the world of professional wrestling. And as always, it's going to be quite a variety show, to say the least. It's going to be quite an interesting episode. But before we begin, I really want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank David Reese for giving me an hour out of his day to talk to the likes of me. And I also want to thank Michael Brandvold, who also was kind enough to grant me the opportunity to interview David Reese, and it was well worth it. And I'm very happy with the end result. It's here on YouTube on the Freeform Friday page. And for those of you that are expecting us to be live on Facebook, as I stated, at some point, we would no longer be doing that. We would no longer be going live on Facebook, strictly on YouTube. And Allan has just joined us. What's going on, sir? How are you?
Well, I'm doing great, David. I tell you, it's great to be back here. And, at Freeform Friday in Montreal, we can almost sense that spring might be in the air. But as it comes to life, just like professional wrestling, not everything is fair.
No, it's not. And I was just talking about the excellent interview that I had this past Saturday. I know you really enjoyed it, and a lot of people did. The feedback so far, the feedback has been overall positive.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it was really great. And kudos to the both Davids, David Buchanan as well as David Reese, for a great interview and super stuff.
And as I said, if you haven't seen it already, it is up on the YouTube channel, Freeform Friday. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified every single time we post new content and we go live. And also Michael Brandvold, who was nice enough to grant me this interview with David Reese, also posted it on his YouTube channel.
Really? Nice. All right, Michael. Thank you.
So let's get right into it. I mean, I know we have a lot of subjects to discuss and a couple of rewrites and retooling, so to speak. How shall we begin?
Well, I guess the best thing to do for me is to go back to talk about the two deaths that, one was actually a death that happened now this past month, and the other was the commemoration of a death. I mean, we can talk about the commemoration of a death later, but I guess, or we can talk about both of them now. I'm not sure which would be preferable, but I guess I could at least start off with the death that has occurred the last few weeks in wrestling. Not a very well publicized death because basically, again, what it comes down to is that this gentleman, though extremely important in wrestling history, did not fall under the, shall we say, the umbrella or the narrative of a lot of WWE, I shouldn't say rhetoric, but they have the narrative very much. And even though he worked in a bunch of different places, he never really worked for the NWA in terms of Jim Crockett promotions, certainly not WCW. Sorry, I'm just making a technical adjustment. That didn't make a difference. Okay. He never worked for the World Wrestling Entertainment or in its previous incarnations much so, or at all. So he's kind of been forgotten in the in the annals of mainstream wrestling history by all but those who grew up watching him, watched him as adults, or wrestling historians. So I kind of fall into the third category. Here, both of us at Freeform Friday are are wrestling historians, and we'd like to take a little time to pay tribute to the late, some people knew him as Frankie Kane. Some people knew him as the Great Mephisto. He is one of wrestling's true survivors that goes all the way back to basically the 30s and 40s. And he's one of the few people who was still around who could talk to you about Nature Boy Buddy Rogers in his earlier days. He could take you through the formation of territories and moving away from the carnival scene. Very, very big in certain areas of the United States, like Ohio and Tennessee, of course. Made a lot of waves in Tennessee. He was in Georgia Championship Wrestling for a while after he had already, I think, pretty much retired from the ring. And his career actually spanned like a good 50-something years, and he finally left this earth at about 93 years old. Nobody's really sure if he's exactly 93. Apparently, even the Great Mephisto himself was not completely sure because as a child, he was orphaned, and there was a lot of mix-ups with the papers and the documentation, and there was uncertainty. And as a young child, he was, or even an older child, he was in a certain smaller city in Ohio and was basically, I don't know about roaming the streets, but he was certainly walking around and looking at some of the boxing and wrestling exhibitions that were going on, and he basically fell in love with it. And that's how he started, the wheels started turning. And he was really one of the greatest minds in all of wrestling, somebody who even like a Bill Watts or an Eddie Graham or certainly a Jim Crockett, Jerry Jarrett. I mean, all these people could look in some kind of reverence to the kind of genius this man was. His real name, I believe, was, I want to say Gene Ault, spelled A-U-L-T, but most people knew him as Frankie Kane. And then later on, he sort of pioneered a wrestling chic type character. And he sort of predated the original Sheik, Sabu's uncle, Ed Farhat. Most people believe that Ed Farhat was the first Sheik in wrestling. He was not. And actually, some people might be more familiar with Frankie Kane's nephew, General Skandor Akbar, who was really Jim Webbe, a guy who legitimately of Middle Eastern descent, who became a wrestling sheik known as General Skandor Akbar, both in the Mid-South Bill Watts, Oklahoma territory, eventually the UWF, and of course in the Von Erichs, Texas-based world-class championship wrestling, and later the USWA. So General Skandor Akbar was apparently the nephew of Gene Ault, or I think his first name was Gene. And he basically pioneered a lot of that. He was like one of, if not the wrestling's the first Sheik in wrestling. He also pioneered, I think, a lot of the fireball throwing, which later became associated with the Sheik and eventually with Jerry the King Lawler, somebody who would throw fire at their opponents. And one of the real reason the Great Mephisto, Frankie Kane was throwing fire at people is because they developed, he was part of a tag team in Memphis wrestling back in the 1960s called the Infernos. And much of where they got their name was that they were associated with the phenomenon of fire. And this included being able to throw fire the way that became famous later with Jerry Lawler, Eddie Gilbert, of course, the Sheik. I'm sure a bunch of guys in WWE. And I know, I think Hulk Hogan tried it once and did it badly at King of the Ring, or they threw a fireball at him, or maybe that was two different occasions. Maybe you can enlighten me, David. When did Hulk Hogan throw fire?
I don't recall Hogan ever. Oh. Well, I can give you, you're right about two instances. So the first instance where a fireball was thrown at the late Hulk Hogan was at the 1993 King of the Ring, when Harvey Whippleman was in disguise, posing as a cameraman, and he got up on top of the apron. Hulk Hogan went up to him, and Harvey would flash his camera, which would set off a fireball.
Yeah.
And which would lead the late Rodney Onawai Yokozuna to gain the upper hand or momentum and recapture the WWF title at the 1993 King of the Ring.
Yes, right. I remember that. But didn't Hogan botch a fire? Oh, that was botched. That
Yes,
was
it was to say it was a botch is a huge understatement. So that was during his very oh so horrible stinky wart infested rematch against the Ultimate Warrior at WCW's Halloween Havoc 1998,
oh,
where Hulk Hogan had a bunch of flash paper and he was trying to, you know, throw the fire, but then he ended up the fireball or the fire ended up going in Hogan's own face, burning off his eyebrows. And the Warrior was supposed to get hit with a fireball, and then he was supposed to make a blind comeback. So that was Hulk Hogan's failed attempt at throwing a fire. But the spot where Harvey Whippleman hit Hulk Hogan with the fireball was spot on.
apologize. Had to
No
make a
worries.
bit of a technical adjustment there.
No worries.
Yeah, so that's it. So people probably remember more Hogan's fireball and the fireballs of guys like Jerry the King Lawler and the Sheik, but the Great Mephisto Frankie Kane sort of predated that, and he had one of the best minds, as I was saying, in wrestling. He could promote, he could book, he could wrestle, he could manage. Later years, he managed more, and he was one of wrestling's true survivors who could talk to you about the days of the carnivals, sort of going into the early days of the territories and all through, and just to what the opposite of a tragic story in wrestling. He had a super long life, and he made it to almost his mid-90s, and but an unsung hero of professional wrestling because he didn't ply his trade in the WWF, and in essence, not for Mid Atlantic so much or Jim Crockett Promotions. So those are the two areas that are sort of remembered in wrestling history the most, I guess, in this part of the world, aside from Japan and Mexico and stuff. So he kind of gets relegated to sort of a, like that WWE Hall of Fame wing where you just pass the name quickly and you don't really think about what they accomplished or what have you. So, but anyway, rest in peace, Gene Alt, I think was his real name. Otherwise known as Frankie Kane, aka the Great Mephisto, part of the Infernos, managed by J.C. Dykes. He was so brilliant and really underrated by those who didn't know how great he really was. So that's an unfortunate one of wrestling's last survivors, kind of that age range, I think, and he'll be missed by those who remember him. And go see him on the internet if you can find some stuff about him. So watch some of the stuff.
And we also had an anniversary that we wish to talk about as well.
Yeah, that's the you're talking about the death anniversary, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is a very sad one especially for more modern wrestling fans. But unfortunately, it's the 10th anniversary of the loss of Axel Rotten, who was brought into this world under the name Brian Knighton. And he was so good at what he did. He had me fooled too. I actually thought he was British for a lot of years. And then I later realized he was just such a good impressionist of using accents and dialects. And he wasn't actually British. He was actually American. But he actually was so convincing as the British punk character, Axel Rotten. And his story is certainly interesting. He was trained very much in the old school back in the 80s, and he was trained by the late Ricky Lawless, whose life actually came to an end, unfortunately, via homicide, which is another story for another day. Also, some of you may remember the enhancement talent Jumpin' Joey Maggs, or sometimes just Joey Maggs on WCW and occasionally WWF television. David, do you remember Joey Maggs?
The name is familiar. The name is definitely familiar. I remember, he was just one of those guys that was enhancement talent or one of the people that makes you look good.
Yeah. He was, and I think what I remember him most for in that role was on Clash of the Champions 14. I think it was Sid. Uh, Sid just totally destroyed him at Clash of the Champions. Like it was like watching him like raw meat be fed to be fed to a pulverizer. It was like really an intense squash, and you almost hope that Joey even had a tiny chance. But Sid, God rest his soul, was late. Was I mean, he was brutal in his efficiency of destroying Joey Maggs there. But he did have a very brief run in Memphis in the USWA where they tried to make him a mid carder, and they tried to play up his heritage and turned him into Joseph Magliano. So he transformed from Joey Maggs into a guy you wouldn't want to mess with, kind of an old school gangster named Joseph Magliano, which I remember pretty well. Wasn't too convincing, I guess. Didn't work, and next thing you know, he's back in the major leagues, sort of doing enhancement talent work. But he was responsible for the ladder training a little bit. Mostly it was Ricky Lawless, but he got Axel Rotten going, and Axel Rotten had some interesting twists and turns in his career. In the late '80s, he was basically tearing up some of the independents. And in the early '90s, he actually started his own independent wrestling federation called the Universal Independent Championship Wrestling, if I recall. And they actually had a good television spot on some of the ABC affiliates in the early '90s. So they had like good television, which was very unusual for an independent group at that time. So he kept that going for a couple of years, but he was also called into the Global Wrestling Federation, another independent regional territory that got a great television spot, which tried to follow in the footsteps of Fritz von Erich and World Class Championship Wrestling, under the leadership originally of Joe Pedicino, who some of you may remember as the host of the long wrestling block in America with Gordon Soley, Pro Wrestling This Week. He was also a commentator and was well known, especially in the southern states in wrestling. His wife, Bonnie Blackstone, got a brief run as a WWF interviewer in 1993. I think after Gene Okerlund, Mean Gene, had left the WWF, his wife, Bonnie Blackstone, got a short run as a commentator. But anyway, so in the Global Wrestling Federation, Axel Rotten did fairly well. But then, of all things, WCW came calling because I think it was Dusty Rhodes who had seen him on television, and Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, of course, who David has personified in many great instances, basically gave him a call, and they were kind of desperate at WCW because the one-man gang, the fearsome 450-pound one-man gang, who at that time was part of Kevin Sullivan's army. This is about less than a year after he had finished his run as Akeem, the African Dream, in the WWF, had departed WCW rather suddenly, and he was in the middle of a feud with the Rap Master PN News. Now, I know, David, you remember the Rap Master PN News, right?
Yo, baby, yo, baby, yo.
That's right.
Or no,
Yeah.
baby, no.
Yeah. That's how it turned. And it was almost surprising he didn't get a run with the WWF, although they were interested. They were interested because, I mean, he was if anything, he was a character, but unfortunately the paths crossed and he didn't make it to the WWF. I think he went back to Europe at that point. But basically the one-man gang had nobody to feud with. They had been pushing PN News against him. So at that time, Axel Rotten was a lot bigger than later in his career. He had major girth. So they thought, let's bring in Axel Rotten. And so he got his big break in WCW in October of 1991. And he left the Global Wrestling Federation. But unfortunately, it was very short-lived. It consisted of 2 matches on television, a bunch of house show matches, quickly slotted into the one-man gang's position in that feud. And after the feud with the one-man gang, he left again. They couldn't figure out what to do with him. Or this was around the time I think that Jim Herd was finishing up as the head of WCW, and they were about to switch to K. Allen Fry. But I think only Dusty Rhodes. There weren't too many people who championed him, but Dusty really liked him. But Dusty, yeah. So in any case, he left, and next thing you know, he's running his own group, like I was saying, Universal Independent Championship Wrestling, based out of Maryland. And the next thing that happened is when he was in WCW, he rubbed elbows with a man named Paul Heyman, who was working as the head of the Dangerous Alliance, Paulie Dangerously, the man who runs the Danger Zone there in WCW, and of course was involved in some pretty absurd feuds and when he was on his own. But the Dangerous Alliance was quite good. In 1993, of course, by 93, Paul Heyman gets fired from WCW. And next thing you know, he's taken over Eastern Championship Wrestling from Eddie Gilbert's booking hands and starts working with Todd Gordon. And in comes Axel Rotten, who has been working a lot of the independents around the northeastern United States and even running his own independent group. So Axel Rotten's ECW career was pretty storied. He wound up training his kayfabe brother, Ian Rotten, before that. They became a tag team known as the Bad Breed, but much like the Rockers, Jannetty and Michaels eventually didn't get along. Well, neither did Axel and Ian. And art imitated life, and they had a match where the loser had to break up with his tag team partner. It was the Pitbulls against the Bad Breed, Axel and Ian Rotten. Axel and Ian lost. They broke up and then began a very fearsome feud with each other, which was pretty hot stuff in 1995. It was one of the most, shall we say, blistering feuds of that year. I mean, WWF and WCW were not exactly putting out the the best stuff they've ever put out. So ECW was pretty much easily topping them in terms of intensity, often match quality, and this and that. And Axel versus Ian was a pretty hot feud. After that, Axel formed a number of tag teams with the Shaw Hack Myers, formed a team actually with Devon Dudley when Devon Dudley, I think, was ousted from the Dudley family. So I think Bubba and Devon were on opposite sides of the ring at that time. They were foes rather than allies. And Axel teamed with Devon for a while. But the team that would really gain him notoriety toward the last couple years of ECW was the Hardcore Chair Swinging Freaks that he formed with Balls Mahoney, who had, of course, been Boo Bradley, I think, in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Of course, the late John Reckner. Balls Mahoney and Axel formed quite a tag team, and next thing you know, they took it pretty much all the way till about 99, and then Axel returned to the independent scene. He did a bunch of stuff. He came back for ECW One Night Stand in the WWE, which I believe was in 2005. But he admitted that in his personal life, he had a lot of issues with substance dependence and I don't know, maybe other things too. I don't know. But definitely he was very much into heroin for a lot of years. And I don't need to, of course, tell people that that's a pretty dangerous occupation to maybe I shouldn't call it an occupation, but it's a dangerous sort of, pattern and way of life. And very sadly, in 2016, he had been in the business for decades. He was, a pretty well-liked guy and very intelligent, but unfortunately, he was staying at a hotel in a town in Maryland called, I believe, Linthicum. I'd never heard of it before, but he was a Maryland guy, and he went next door to the McDonald's next to his hotel, and unfortunately died of a drug overdose at the McDonald's, and he was unfortunately found in a bathroom stall, and that was the end of his life. Brian Knighton, aka Axel Rotten, and he gave a lot of himself. He certainly bled a lot. He certainly got banged around a lot. He loved pro wrestling and he loved giving himself to it. And unfortunately, he was taken away too soon. And we commemorate, it's been 10 years now since Axel has been gone. But check out his stuff if you can. And not just in ECW. You could see him in Global online. You could see him in WCW for that brief stint a little. You could see him in Universal Independent Championship Wrestling, I believe, the UICW. So Rest in peace, Axel Rotten. You are missed. 10 years later, a very, very intelligent, capable guy who sacrificed a lot to be part of the industry that he loved so much.
Yes, indeed. And one of the matches that really stood out to me was the Taipei death match that Ian and Axel Rotten had.
Yeah, absolutely. That was his specialty match, basically, and he saved that for the big blow-offs of the feuds that he was in. And of course, what feud was bigger than his feud with Ian Rotten? I mean, there were some big feuds he was involved in, but against his own kayfabe brother, it was a big one. Axel and Ian later made up in life, and they didn't finish as enemies in real life, but there was no love lost between them in a shoot sense back in '95 when they were feuding in the ring. They also weren't getting along at all in real life either. So art imitated life in that sense.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, we had a lot, and we have quite a banger of a show this week. So, where shall I begin? Will it be? I guess we'll go in order of topics that we discussed. The 39th anniversary of New Japan Pro Wrestling's New Year Dash 1987 in Tokyo, which would be the second annual Super Show, which would take place on February 5th at the Ryogoku Koku Ikan with 10,020 fans looking on.
Yes, it was, and this was actually the second annual New Japan New Year's Dash show, and New Japan was really hot at this time. It would be a couple of years before All Japan would take away some of that spotlight, at least share it. But New Japan was extremely exciting at this time, and Antonio Inoki knew how to put on great shows and had great themes for shows. And this is an example of a show that began a year earlier in '86. And in '87, they had a nice mix of a lot of homegrown Japanese stars with the imported talent from America. And the matches that involve some American talent are more the ones I'm going to focus on because I don't know how familiar people are with. I mean, some of the top names I'm sure some people are familiar with, but where it crosses over into North American stars being going over there is kind of like usually the big heels because the big idea was, of course, for the Japanese wrestlers to triumph against their foreign enemies. And Antonio Inoki was really good at doing this. And a very interesting match on this show actually involved none other than Konga the Barbarian, who would later go on to be known simply as the Barbarian from the Powers of Pain, would go on to become Sione the Head Shrinker, and obviously his well-known team in WCW with Ming. But at this time, Konga the Barbarian was working for Jim Crockett Promotions and pretty much, and he was in Paul Jones' stable in the NWA. But he was a big name in Japan too, and being from Samoa, like Samoans were often very well regarded in Japanese wrestling, certainly in this era of Japanese wrestling. And the guy who Konga the Barbarian actually defeated on the show is rather interesting because it was none other than Daryl Peterson, going by his real name. David, might you venture a guess who Daryl Peterson later went on to be? No?
I don't know.
All right. Well, Daryl Peterson would soon show up in Memphis with a gimmick known as Max Payne, the future Man Mountain Rock. Yeah.
Oh, the guy that keeps threatening to release that home video of his time in the WWF on the European tour, while all the boys are taking into some recreational goodies.
Yeah, which again, I don't know how much impact it has 30 years later, but I guess for those who love that era, yeah, I guess it could be interesting. He's claiming that there's no problem releasing such a film because he said that Vince McMahon himself signed off on it, that it's interesting, go ahead. And So he doesn't have to seek, apparently, the individual permission, according to him, of the wrestlers he shot footage of, because their images are owned by WWE, and Vince McMahon, up until a few years ago, was the owner of WWE, or at least the CEO, whatever. So so he says he's planning to do it. But anyway, back to '87. Daryl Peterson was an up and coming amateur wrestling star, I think from the University of Iowa, if I'm not mistaken. And some people may remember he went on to a famous tag team with Cactus Jack, Mick Foley, who put on great matches in WCW with the Nasty Boys. They went for a couple of barn burners at consecutive pay-per-views in 1994. And Max Payne had basically... Cactus Jack, I think, was teaming with somebody else before that. This was after his feud with Vader. Or did he start right away with Max Payne after that? I don't recall. But the feud I remember Max Payne for, actually, was kind of a shameful one. It's that feud with Johnny B. Bad, where he Mark Miro, where he shot the Bad Blaster of confetti right in Bad's face, and Mark Miro had to pretend to kind of be blind for a while. So Max Payne put up his guitar, who he called Norma Jean, against Mark Miro's Johnny B. Bad's Bad Blaster. It was a tremendously dumb idea for a feud, but this was, I think, when Ole Anderson had taken over the book in WCW from Dusty Rhodes. But it did expose Max Payne to major league audiences, and of course the team with Cactus, and then by 1995, of course, Titan Sports. Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation came calling, and the guitar playing, legitimate guitar playing. This wasn't Jeff Jarrett singing With My Baby Tonight. Legitimate guitar hero, none other than Man Mountain Rock. I certainly loved his entrances. I don't know if I loved it after the bell rang, but I liked his entrances quite a bit. But he fell victim, like many, to the politics of a lot of the group's people, the cliques that were in charge. No, definitely pun intended. Not a big favorite of Shawn Michaels and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and Sean Waltman and all them. And so basically, I think Kevin Nash even told him he's not going to succeed with that gimmick. So he kind of felt right then and there that he was doomed, because if Kevin Nash, who's walking around with the World Heavyweight title as Big Daddy Cool Diesel, says you're not going to get over, well, it doesn't exactly bode well for you. And obviously Nash had a lot of political power behind the scenes, as we know, and unfortunately it didn't work out. So yeah, he did film that film, and didn't do much in American rings after that of note. But back on this Japanese show, he was simply Daryl Peterson, and he lost to Konga the Barbarian. So no shame to lose to a tough guy with a lot of talent and experience like Konga. And at that point in his career, what else would you expect? I think Konga was accepted by the Japanese fans much more than an American would be, because of his Samoan heritage. And if you ever have a chance, people, to check out Konga the Barbarian with Paul Jones, just at the time, even before the Powers of Pain were formed, you won't be sorry. He's always great to watch. And some people call him Barb for short, affectionately. One of the nicest guys outside the ring. I had the privilege of meeting him one time, and him and Haku, I mean, they were just such incredible gentlemen. Haku, of course, a legendary name in Japan too, as well as the United States. But on this show, the other match of note that involves an American is actually the main event of New Japan New Year's Dash, and that had Antonio Inoki himself stepping into the ring. Usually when Antonio Inoki stepped into the ring by the late 80s, you weren't going to get like a very good match in the ring, but Inoki was so popular and so reputable that even if he wasn't working fantastically, I'm not sure he was ever a fantastic worker, but he was definitely a fantastic persona with lots of merchandise. We always talk about Vince McMahon and merchandise. Like Antonio Inoki has cool merchandise that was sold in Japan a lot back then. And he was going against a young wrestler by the name of Crusher Bam Bam Bigelow, who we all know, of course, and also had a run at the same time as Man Mountain Rock did. But of course, in the 80s, Bam Bam burst upon the scene in the WWF and was pushed as the hottest thing since fire, like the flames on his head. and eventually would wind up in the NWA. And then, of course, other promotions like the UWF would have amazing runs in Japan, teaming with Vader. Would come back, of course, to the WWF, and they thought Bigelow was good enough to carry him. Well, I think it's because not just the main event, but Inoki needed a really good, solid worker, I think, to work with. I think that's why, coupled with Bam Bam's amazing look, I think that's probably two of the major reasons that he got the main event at this show. And it says something that Bam Bam could carry a New Japan event, main event, like back in '87 when he was such a young rookie. He was barely in his mid-20s at this point. And Inoki, of course, got the win, but it was a disqualification win. It's hard to picture Antonio Inoki pinning Bam Bam Bigelow. They didn't want to ruin him before they started him, I guess. And it kind of looks weird, a guy like Inoki pinning this giant monster. But anyway, Inoki won by DQ, and that's New Japan New Year's Dash back on February 5th, 1987. And we lift a proverbial glass to the 39th anniversary of that show.
And then we go to the 31st anniversary of February 6, 1995, Memphis, Tennessee. The Mid-South Coliseum show which saw an important title change in the main event. The show only drew 1,100 people to watch.
Yeah, it was a sad time for the USWA. You know, they were about 6 years removed from their foundation in Texas when they tore down the world-class banner and tried to be a double state promotion between Texas and Tennessee, and it didn't really it didn't work out in Texas for sure. And in Tennessee, they just went back to doing Memphis wrestling. And over the years in the early 90s, the crowds kept getting smaller and smaller despite their talent agreement trade with the WWF from 1992 onward. And here you have an example of a guy who's so major league, and none other than Psycho Sid, Sid Justice, Sid Vicious, Sid Udy, whatever you want to call him, one half of the Skyscrapers, who, basically he was kind of a much bigger star than anybody there. And he was between jobs at that time. It was, I guess it was more than a year removed from the horrific violent incident in the British hotel room with Arn Anderson, at which point he lost his WCW job, and he was still a few weeks away from returning to the WWF to be Shawn Michaels' bodyguard. So Sid was working in Memphis and I guess working out some of the rust if he had any, and he not hard to picture him as the champion compared to I mean, I'm not saying he was the greatest wrestler in the world, but as a persona, I mean, he looked amazing, and his promos were so intense, and, you know, he didn't look minor league at all, whereas some of the USWA people were, you know, it was reputed to be a promotion where either rookies would get their start and learn how to work, because you could work like 7 nights a week, and the pay was really bad, obviously. Steve Austin was a prime example of somebody who started on that circuit, and his stories about poverty in those early days were quite legendary. And but a guy like Sid was super major, and it's hard to believe, but well, actually, what happened on this show is he basically lost the title, and the reason he lost the title basically is because he had just signed another agreement with the WWF after being absent since 1992. Many of you will remember he was in the main event of WrestleMania 8 against Hulk Hogan, was going to start a feud with the Ultimate Warrior, but then he quit a few days after WrestleMania, and that was that for him and Titan Sports. Now, unfortunately, if you fast forward to 1995, Titan Sports is in a lot more trouble. They desperately need heels. They desperately need big names. They have a babyface world champion who's 7 feet tall, the aforementioned Kevin Nash. So, so Sid fit the bill to give him another chance. And so he finished up kind of around here in the USWA, lost the title to the king of Memphis, none other than Jerry Lawler, of course, who was doing double duty with WWF and USWA. So the main event of this show was actually pretty important because there was a title change, and titles didn't change hands as often as they do these days. But I mean, the USWA title, it did change hands fairly often, and even made men like Coco Beware, I think, and Todd Champion, their title holders in between reigns of Jerry Lawler or whoever. So yeah, the belt could change hands sometimes fairly often, but in this case, I guess they really needed to get the belt off of Sid because Sid was heading north to the WWF for his famous second run, which would see him morph into Psycho Sid, and everybody obviously knows about his rather interesting run in 1995 and 96 all the way into 97. We just talked about it a few weeks ago. I remember we talked about Sid's WWF run during the New Generation era as it was starting to transition into the Attitude era. Another interesting couple guys on this particular Memphis show, I'd like to mention the Spellbinder, who had the briefest cup of coffee I've ever seen practically in the WWF. Some of you may remember they had this one-shot deal of a guy named Fantasio, a wrestler who was also knew how to do magic tricks, a la the Black Scorpion, but in this case, the guy was actually a legitimate magician. Do you remember Fantasio, David?
I don't remember watching his. I don't recall seeing his match on TV, but I heard all about the controversy on Bruce Pritchard's podcast where he almost started a fire he did start a fire backstage.
Yeah, that certainly didn't help his chances of being hired full time, I guess. No, and really the gimmick was like it was a very good idea in general, but they didn't exactly carry it out in a great way. Like imagine like Papa Shango if he could do like real magic and not just like tricks with the lights and the and stuff like that. Like this guy could actually do real magic. So I think the potential was there. He was a good worker in Memphis. He had a great physique. He had a good look. I don't know how his interviews were. I mean, not probably spectacular, but you almost didn't even need to have him speak because his gimmick was just, I mean, wasn't even totally a gimmick. It was legit, and he actually did magic tricks during the match that we're talking about. That he only lasted one match on TV. He did a house show. I remember he did a house show with late Louis Spicoli, who was working as Brad Radford at that time, but he was never used again. And as you said, there was some controversy backstage, and it's too bad because he really had a gimmick and even a look that was actually, I mean, how much worse could they have done in the summer of 1995, with the pig farmers and the garbage men and the clowns who were not Matt Bourne, no offense to the great Ray Apollo. But it was not exactly, they weren't exactly over an overabundance of, very intriguing characters at that time. So anyway, for whatever reason, Harry Del Rios, a.k.a. the Spellbinder, who had a good run in Memphis, did not make it in the WWF, and it could have been probably a wasted opportunity for the WWF in a way because it's not like they were just doing so well at that time. They could have used anything to get attention. But I guess Fantasio wasn't it. Also on the show, you had Scott Studd. Do you remember when Scott Studd briefly made a WWF appearance before becoming?
Before that, I wanted to just say something about Fantasio because I didn't know the name of the wrestler until you brought it up, but and I didn't watch. This is a bit of a sidebar here, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. For those of you that watched the Elimination Chamber PLE this past weekend, we saw the debut of none other than Danhausen. And that's what Danhausen reminded me of Fantasio. I just couldn't remember the name at the time. But somewhat similar, not quite. Danhausen has a lot more, he's not a real magician, but he has much more showman. I would say a bit more of an edge to him than Fantasio ever did.
Well, Fantasio, it wasn't exactly a debut with much fanfare. I don't know exactly how Danhausen debuted, but I'm sure it was with a bit more panache than Fantasio just doing a random squash match on Wrestling Challenge. in the summer of '95. So,
Well, it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube, and you'll see it. And well, the fan reaction wasn't as what people thought it would be, but his little skit the next 2 nights later on Monday Night Raw was a little bit better.
yeah, I think I saw that. But didn't they have the same problem when Powerhouse Hobbs debuted at the Royal Rumble that people were just
Yeah,
sitting on their
yes,
hands?
but at least, but the thing is, with Royce Keys, Powerhouse Hobbs, he only debuted at the Royal Rumble. We haven't seen him since. Well, with the exception of appearing on Stephanie McMahon's "What's Your Story" podcast, but have we seen him in a wrestling ring since the Royal Rumble? No. But we've seen Danhausen at least appear on Monday on Raw with his presenting general manager Adam Pierce with his list of Demandhausen.
I see. You think they're going to repackage Powerhouse Hobbs or Royce Keys? Is that why?
To be quite honest, I don't know. This is another typical thing where they hire a guy. He's a big guy, good look, good physique, and they don't know what to do with him.
Isn't that the problem with AEW? They debut people and then they just disappear off TV. Isn't that's where he came from?
Well, that's exactly. Well, both companies honestly are guilty of doing the exact same thing.
Well, for Royce Keys fans out there, it's too bad they're not getting to see their guy. Maybe they will again soon. But yeah, so back to Scott Studd. Do you remember when Scott Studd had a cup of coffee in the WWF before becoming Scotty Riggs?
No, I do not.
Well, he actually was pushed as a friend of Lex Luger, as Lex Luger was about to form full time the Allied Powers with Davey Boy Smith. Scott Studd, who was basically coming from the USWA, basically in Memphis, was holding and waving the American flag as Luger's friend Scott Anton. He used the name Scott Anton. So another buff built guy who would actually go team with the future Buff Bagwell. Right after this period, he didn't last. Another guy who barely was there for a day in the WWF went on, of course, to be half of the infamous American Males, who I know you do remember, on Monday Nitro for WCW. And yeah, Scott, so, well, at least he had work in the smaller territories before that in the regional promotions. And he was, somewhat successful as Scott Studd. On this particular show, he got a DQ win over Gorgeous George III, who, if I'm not mistaken, had a run in WCW under another name, but the name escapes me right now because these were the dying days of WCW, Monday Nitro, and Thursday Night Thunder, which were I wouldn't even say they were yawn fests. They were painful. They were just painful to. I can remember the late Bobby Heenan even saying it was pretty painful to commentate this period because the shows were just so bad and absurd and disjointed that. Yeah, pretty much something. But we also had Miss Texas on the show, and I believe Miss Texas is going to be a part of the GPW wrestling convention in May, right?
Yes, that's correct. None other than Miss Jacqueline.
Miss Jacqueline, the future Miss Jacqueline, who was still the young and very agile and very talented Miss Texas, working not in Texas at this time, of course, in Tennessee for the USWA. So, these were the names that were, and they still only drew 1,000 whatever people. The Mid-South Coliseum, used to draw 10,000 people at its peak, they could do it Monday after Monday. So these were unfortunately the downhill slide days of the USWA, and well, they were about to lose Sid, as I was saying. So it wasn't an absolutely stellar show by any means, but you had the Moondogs, you had the usual Memphis guys like Tony Williams. You had what you had. The Spellbinder would get one little shot a few months later in WWF. Sid would go on to do well for himself back in the WWF, and Jerry the King would always be Jerry the King. So that's the 31st anniversary of this important title change in USWA history.
And for those of you that are interested about the show that we just alluded to coming up on May the 30th, you can go to lepointdevente.com and for GPW Legends Mania. That's GPW Legends Mania. And I can share the I can also share the link with you right here if you'd like. And if you'd like to get your tickets, general admission will cost $42. And there is a special 1 p.m. VIP option, if you will. And that's $52.92 each. So more than 13 legends are going to be there and have already been confirmed, and many more will be announced soon. As of now, as it stands, we have the fabulous Rougeau brothers, Jacques and Raymond Rougeau, Jimmy Hart, the Mouth of the South, and another man who will be here in Montreal not this coming Saturday, but in a few Saturdays from now on, Saturday, March the 28th, Jake the Snake Roberts. But we don't know if Cheryl's going to be there as well on the 30th, but on March of May, but on March 28th, Jake the Snake Roberts will be there, along with 2025 WWE Hall of Famer, the Total Package Lex Luger, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Mosh and Thrasher the Headbangers, Coco Beware, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Jacqueline, Sean Mooney, and Sarah Page, who is known as an exact China lookalike.
Yeah, I when I saw that, I was very mesmerized. Does she do like a circuit of I don't know, like doing impressions of China? Is that what she does?
Not quite sure. Not quite sure, but here I'm going to post the comment right here. I'm going to post it here in the chat. So for those of you that are watching it now or will be watching the replay, so it is timestamped. So right about at this time, this is where I plug Legends Mania, GPW, May the 30th at the Centre Slush Puppy. And if you want to purchase your tickets, all you have to do is I provided the link in the comments on YouTube. Feel free to go ahead and purchase. No time like the present. And huge shout out to Martin Villeneuve-Yanone and Stéphane Gauthier over at WCA Wrestling Collectible Auctions and GPW Gatineau Professional Wrestling.
Yeah, that's right. So it's almost like the Lex Express will be stopping in Gatineau on May 30th.
All right. So there's also a fascinating incident that we wanted to discuss that took place 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, on February the 2nd, where after being struck in the face by her legendary opponent, Susan Tex Green, put the NWA Women's Champion, the Fabulous Moolah, in a shoot submission hold and gave up the match. Green would hold the Women's Championship for several days before being forced by Vince McMahon Sr. to give it back, re-awarding it to Moolah. And Green's title reign was subsequently not recognized by the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, or the WWWF at the time.
Well, yeah, and basically it's strange. It's a footnote in wrestling history. It's something that's happened before in different situations, often in Japan, or when a match was held for a title where the promotion that had jurisdiction was far away from where the match was taking place. This was a little bit different. I mean, it was a sanctioned NWA event in the United States. It was pretty odd. It's kind of forgotten because Moolah would brag forever that she was the champion for 35 years straight or whatever. And this was technically one of those interruptions. I mean, it's kind of like Ric Flair, where he actually, he lost the title more than the 7 or 8 times the first big run that we thought he did, because, but then they either didn't say anything or they they quickly gave the belt back to him, or without even having like a legitimate match, or some wrestler would pull a fast one so he could be declared the NWA champion. I'm not even sure that Otto Wands didn't try that in Vern Gagne's AWA. I don't remember specifically, but I think something like that happened with that in the AWA too. And yeah, there were definitely instances throughout history where an unauthorized title change that wasn't recognized by the promoter that allowed their champion to wrestle in another territory or another country or what have you. I think it's happened in Puerto Rico. It's happened in Japan. It's happened in the United States and Canada, I guess, too. But basically, yeah, it was another situation a bit like Moolah herself would be involved in, with that whole weird incident with Wendy Richter and the Spider Lady, where they had to get the WWF Women's Championship off of Wendy Richter. So it was supposed to be Leilani Kai under the mask, but turned out the Spider Lady in Madison Square Garden was actually Moolah, who was supposed to, I think, manage Leilani Kai. And there were claims that Wendy didn't even know it was her, and kind of pulled a Montreal Screwjob type of thing on Wendy in Madison Square Garden. I mean, this was kind of a bit like that. But I mean, Susan Green is kind of a somewhat forgotten name, and in the annals of wrestling history, Moolah has developed some questionable infamy following posthumously, which is another story. But in the actual wrestling ring, I mean, Moolah, of course, had a storied career, and some of that was based on the idea that she evolved from the valet slave girl Moolah to the never-ending women's champion until Wendy Richter, and then later when she lost it to, of course, Sherry Martel in Texas in the summer of 1987. But this was a strange interruption. And also, this was the time when the NWA and the WWF were trading talent. So Dusty Rhodes would come up from Florida. Even Ric Flair would wrestle in New York for a little bit. And then, and Bob Backlund would go down to Florida to wrestle Harley Race for the world titles. Superstar Billy Graham did the same thing. He would go wrestle when he was WWF champion. He would go wrestle the NWA champion. So here we see it with the women's title, and I'm guessing Sue Green was not supposed to win that. They gave the belt back to Moolah. It happened in Montreal too, right, David, with the Rougeau brothers and the Hart Foundation, except that wasn't unplanned. They basically, well, at least on the part, I'm guessing, of the Hart Foundation or the WWF, they gave the belt to the Rougeaus one night in Montreal, and then 3 days later, it was null and void by the president, Jack Tunney, the figurehead WWF president, right?
Yes. And that was something that I talked about in my interview with Marc Blondin.
Right. Another great interview, just like David Reese. Fantastic interview.
Another fantastic interview. And for those of you that haven't watched it, it is up on our YouTube channel. Please go and watch it. Soyez-y, monsieur.
Yeah, that's right. And I just had this memory. I think where I remember the name Susan Green a lot for was, I don't think I'm wrong, I seem to remember in the early 90s, her name would pop up all over certain wrestling magazines because she was involved in apartment wrestling. She would wrestle women without audiences around for basically lustful people who wanted to see beautiful, scantily clad women throw each other around apartments, if I'm not mistaken. That may be Sue Green. I mean, I might be wrong, but it seems to ring a bell that when they were advertising, you could buy custom-made videotapes and even choose who wrestled who, like almost like an all-you-can-eat menu where you picked the two competitors. And I don't know, it might have been Sue Green was one of those people. I have a weird memory.
We're certainly not talking about the Susie Green on Curb Your Enthusiasm, played by Susie Essman. Not the same Susie Green.
No, definitely not. I don't think I'd want to see Susie Essman in apartment wrestling, unless somebody was maybe. Oh, never mind. So, God bless Susie Essman. She's a wonderful actress, but no, not that Susie Green.
Yes, and a little note about Susie Essman. I don't know if this still happens to her, but apparently she said at one time she used to get accosted in the grocery store, and people used, well, not accost her or bother her, but they would come up to her and they would ask her to insult their husband. Like once there was a lady that came up to her in a grocery store as she was looking at a bunch of melons, and she says, "Oh yeah, can you call? I have my husband on the phone. Can you yell at him and call him, a fat expletive?" And just like, what? I'm just looking at melons here. I'm just looking at
Oh,
melons here, and now some random stranger is asking her to call this husband of hers, a fat what.
well, it speaks to Susie Essman's talents that people want her to do that because they know she's like the female Don Rickles, basically. I guess.
All right, so moving on to wrestling. Back to wrestling here. So we also wanted to talk about a look back at the Montreal Forum House Show, which went down on the 8th of February, 1988. And it was there were 18,373 rabid fans piled in the vaunted former arena. And the results really speak for themselves. Quite a stacked card. Chat us up about that.
Right. So this was a very, very interesting time in World Wrestling Federation history. It was coming right off 3 days after the, basically the unforgettable NBC main event of Friday night, the most watched wrestling program in primetime history by a long shot, when Hulk Hogan lost the WWF title by dubious means. His 4-year reign was over. Andre the Giant won the belt, even though there was controversy. Of course, he immediately surrendered the belt to his boss, Ted DiBiase, and of course, DiBiase was stripped of the title. So there was a lot of very odd things going on around this time on television and the storylines. So for the first time, there was, certainly in the 80s, even I think in the 70s, there was no World Wrestling Federation champion. The title would go up for grabs, of course, at the WrestleMania 4 title tournament. So the idea of this house show was to put Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant on opposite sides of the ring, but Andre wasn't wrestling. He was in the corner of Jimmy Hart's heel stable, the Honky Tonk Man and the Hart Foundation, who had a big thing going with Randy Savage at this time. The Randy Savage Honky Tonk Man feud, basically, to me, that was like almost like the top of the tops, because that had such momentum, and that was selling out arenas even without Hulk Hogan being on the card. But Savage and Honky had already fought each other at the Forum, but this time they were going to do a big 6-man tag brouhaha with the super team of the Mega Powers, Hogan and Randy Savage, along with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, going against the Honky Tonk Man and the Hart Foundation. And I almost thought it was a mismatch going in, because, I mean, how could the Honky and the Harts sort of resist that incredible babyface 3-man team? But to their advantage was the fact they were all Jimmy Hart's guys. So the mouth of the South, he could do the strategizing, and the very intimidating idea of Andre the Giant in the corner 3 days after he took the title from Hulk Hogan was certainly, big box office. It was, everybody wanted to see that. That was the big thing. This was the post WrestleMania 3 continuation of that feud of sorts. So also a pretty unusual main event. I mean, it's not almost ever that you would see that kind of, star power packed into a tag team match as a Montreal house show main event. So it was a very interesting card. I mean, the undercard was, it had sort of whatever they could throw it, like almost like they just put it together haphazardly, because all the focus was on that main event, which was kind of a one-time thing. But it was a big deal. It was certainly a big deal. And, they had a full house. They had like over 18,000 people there at the Forum. So these were really the glory days of when the WWF, this was coming off actually 2 house shows after the largest record-breaking amount of fans who packed the Forum for the WWF. And November 28th of 1987, when Hogan would go against the one-man gang, that was the largest attendance. But this was pretty close. This wasn't wasn't far from that either. I mean, 18,000, plus almost 19,000 people was nothing to sneeze at. So this was a very big deal at that time. And well, I mean, the main event had what you pretty much would think. The baby faces did triumph, and I guess the fans certainly went home happy. Hogan, of course, posed, I'm sure. So, as I recall. But, the other matches on the show were kind of interesting in some ways, too. Interestingly enough, they broke up Strikeforce, who were feuding with the Hart Foundation, but were the tag team champions who had took the belts from the Harts, and they were getting ready for their challenge of Demolition, which was the only time you can really remember where the champions seemed to be underdogs going into the match against their challengers, and of course Strikeforce would lose. But at this show, they were doing a bunch of house shows, actually, where Martel was not on the card, and Tito Santana was going at it alone. And in this case, he was going against Ravishing Rick Rude, who, because Paul Orndorff had left the WWF after their brief feud, they never even really finished their feud. Maybe Tito was even slotted into it, I'm not sure. But because Rude didn't have a feud when Orndorff left, and was still a little bit away from starting his legendary feud with Jake the Snake Roberts, who, yes, will be coming to Gatineau and everything, coming in May. Rude and Santana went at it in a bizarre match because you had one half of the tag team champions wrestling in a singles match, and you had Rude, and Rude actually lost, which was a big surprise. But this was the last kind of time before it wasn't a great idea to have Rick Rude lose, because his stock was starting to really go up and up. And after WrestleMania 4 and starting the feud with Jake, well, that would only happen on special occasions, like with the Ultimate Warrior or whatever. Another interesting match on this card is you had the hometown Rougeau brothers going against the Conquistadors, who were starting to get a bit of a, I guess you could call it almost a push. I mean, they did make it into the 1988 Survivor Series at the heel tag team match, because I'm just guessing they were short of heel tag teams, and they needed somebody to take the fall when the Powers of Pain turned heel. So it was the least harmful to have them do that with the Conquistadors. The Conquistadors, of course, were Jose Luis Rivera and Jose Estrada. And in this case, in Montreal, they lost to the Rougeau brothers. Also, Dino Bravo continued his mini rivalry with Don the Rock Morocco, which would span a few house shows. And Morocco, unfortunately, did not get the win as the hometown guy, and heel Dino Bravo would get the win and begin his march toward what he was hoping would be a world title match in the future. And it sure was, because he got to face Randy Savage on 3 consecutive house shows beginning that summer. And he would get his match with Hulk Hogan the next year in the spring, but Hogan was not the champion again yet. This was just before Hogan would begin his second title reign. But Dino Bravo was on a hot streak, and he got the win over Don Morocco. They had what else did they do? They didn't have too much else of note. They had a women's title match. I mentioned Sherry Martel earlier, who defeated the Fabulous Moolah. Here she was defending against Rockin' Robin, the half-sister of the aforementioned Jake the Snake Roberts. And an interesting kind of footnote wrestler in wrestling history, Rockin' Robin, the half-sister also of Sam Houston. Another interesting. Obviously, Jake the Snake was the most famous of those siblings, but Robin was pretty good in the ring, and her and Sherry had good matches. And at this point, Sherry was basically having a good reign as champs. So Robin did the favors and lost to Sherry. And the only other match a note on the show, I guess you could say, was Coco Beware, who, yes, he may have had a run as USWA champion at one point, but, well, he did, I believe. But he also got a win here, which didn't always happen, and it was against none other than the father of Roman Reigns, Sika, the Wild Samoan, who was doing jobs left and right at this point, and he did one to Sika here at the Montreal Forum. So, yeah, a really amazing show, February 8th, back in 88, and the WWF was hot, and the Forum, the Montreal fans were super hot too, and they were hoping their hometown heroes, guys like the Rougeau brothers, and obviously they loved Rick Martel. Dino Bravo was not loved at this point, but but definitely a threat. He had just a few weeks before broke the so-called world bench press record with the help of Jesse the Body Ventura, and was proclaimed the world's strongest man a few weeks before this at the Royal Rumble in Hamilton, Ontario. So Montreal Forum, you had to be there. That was 38 years ago now.
And were you there at that show?
Unfortunately, I missed my chance. I had a chance to. Unfortunately, I passed it up. I regretted it later. But no, unfortunately, I was not at that show. But I did have the chance, and I didn't make it there, unfortunately.
And then this other event that we wanted to discuss was a review of the fifth installment of the Clash of the Champions, which took place back in the day when it was on the TBS Superstation, February 15th, 1989, emanating from the Convention Center in Cleveland, Ohio.
It was a very wacky time in NWA history. It was also an exciting time in the sense that a lot of things were happening all at once, and this Clash of the Champion show was only 5 days before one of the biggest shows in NWA history on pay-per-view, the always loved Chi-Town Rumble, which would take place, of course, in Chicago and would mark the beginning of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat's brief reign as the NWA World Champion, which is still legendary because of his series of matches with Ric Flair. And this Clash of the Champions was the last chance to hype the upcoming Steamboat Flair show. But the interesting backdrop to this is that the amount of change going on behind the scenes in WCW is monumental at this time, because basically what was happening was Dusty Rhodes had been ousted as the booker of the NWA. J.J. Dillon had left to the WWF by this point. Obviously, Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson were gone. The Four Horsemen were basically almost dissolved at this point. Hiro Matsuda had been brought in to basically do a gimmick where he would take over the contracts of Flair and Barry Windham and the former Horsemen and Michael Hayes and all these people with the infamous, was it the JTEX Corporation, or what were they called before that? Kawasaki Incorporated, something like that. But the real story behind the scenes is that George Scott took over as the booker for Dusty Rhodes after Jim Crockett did a couple weeks of booking just to make the transition go easy. Jim Crockett wasn't even the owner of the NWA at this time. Ted Turner had taken it over the November before. Jim Herd was coming in, the infamous Jim Herd, and Jack Petrick was right above him, and the NWA was disjointed. Unbelievably, house show ratings were falling, television ratings were falling. They weren't in a very good way, but the one bright thing that happened, bright spot, was that George Scott had always been a big boon to the career of Ricky Steamboat. So Steamboat was very comfortable coming to the NWA with George Scott booking, whereas he wouldn't have been comfortable coming when Dusty Rhodes was booking, because Steamboat and Dusty Rhodes never saw eye to eye. So after Steamboat left the WWF in the spring of '88, he wouldn't have jumped, as some people might have thought, right away to the NWA, because Dusty Rhodes was basically in charge. But once Dusty was out of the way, Dusty went back to Florida, started his own, took over the Florida wrestling there, and George Scott came in. Steamboat felt very comfortable. So amidst all this chaos and decline of the NWA, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat comes in. So this Clash of the Champions, a lot of it was surrounding, even though Ricky Steamboat just wrestled a squash match on this show and Flair didn't wrestle at all, they did an angle together, which was, I guess you could kind of say, the highlight of the show. I mean, it was the only thing of the show that was kind of memorable was the idea that Steamboat and Flair were starting to, not only, they were already feuding, but the idea was that playing it up like Steamboat is a family man and he has his baby now, which was basically cost him the Intercontinental title in the WWF with that leave of absence he took briefly. And so basically Steamboat was being pushed as the guy that every mom and dad could, be proud to watch with their kid, while Ric Flair was, of course, the womanizing, wheeling, dealing, kiss stealing son of a gun. And he would, like, on this show, I think he came out with a bunch of models wearing a fur coat, and it was all an angle so that Ricky Steamboat could attack him after Flair said some pretty terrible things to him and basically strip him down to his underwear. That was the angle, that Steamboat whipped Flair all around the ring and took his, or maybe he was wearing his beautiful, like, fancy $5,000 suit, and whatever, maybe the coat, then the suit. I don't quite recall the exact clothes he was wearing, but that was the big thing, that he stripped him down to where he was down to basically his underwear and his wrestling boots being whipped all over the ring. And that was kind of the highlight. The rest of the clash was either a mess or it was just uninteresting. The Midnight Express opened the show, and they were still baby faces, which was a very brief time in their career because they were still feuding with Paul Heyman's original Midnight Express, which would also come to an end 5 days later at the Chi-Town Rumble, when Dennis Condrey wouldn't even show up as part of the original Midnight Express, and Randy Rose, his partner, took the fall, and the whole stipulation of that match was the guy who takes the fall has to basically no, not Randy Rose, sorry, I think it was the guy who replaced Dennis Condrey, Jack Victory, may be the one who took the fall, or anyway, whatever it was. No, it was Randy. I forgot now, but I think Randy Rose took the fall. But basically, the Midnight Express were stuck as baby faces here, and it didn't really fit because, everybody loved to hate Jim Cornette, but because Paul Heyman, as Paulie Dangerously, was more hateable than Cornette, they were baby faces, but they weren't used very well when George Scott took over the book, and he was booking, and it's Midnight Express. They basically were going to go on a nice long vacation not too long after this, before coming back in the month of June. And so you had them get a meaningless win over the Russian Assassins. You had Steamboat do a squash match. Lex Luger, looking great, did a squash match and getting ready for his U.S. title match. Barry Windham was defending the U.S. title against Luger at Chi-Town Rumble, where Luger would win the title. And there were a lot of matches like that. Rick Steiner had a squash match of sorts with Rip Morgan, who would form the New Zealand Militia later that year with Jack Victory, which later came to be known as the Royal Family. Rip Morgan started out as one of the flag bearers for the Sheepherders before they left to become the Bushwhackers in the WWF. Of course, the famous John Laurinaitis, a.k.a. Johnny Ace, also had that flag bearer role at one time. And so Rick Steiner squashed Rip Morgan, and then he showed up at Chi-Town Rumble to lose the television title back to Mike Rotunda, which he had just won at Starrcade 88 True Grit back in December. And Butch Reed kind of made one, I guess you could say, his debut, or just about his debut. He was part of the Hiro Matsuda contingent too, and he got the win over Steve Casey, who, despite a good look, not much personality, he got a push. He didn't get a push. That was almost surprising. But he was kind of like a little bit more than an enhancement talent. He would actually do the first high-profile job to the Great Muta at the next Clash of Champions, the infamous Clash of the Champions 6 in New Orleans, that basically cost George Scott his booking job. But that's another story. The main event of this clash was actually a very strange six-man tag team match with Genichiro Tenryu, speaking of guys from Japan. He was six-man tag team champions with the Road Warriors, who at this time, after just turning heel a few months ago, were pretty much already turning back babyface. It was a pretty strange time. The booking was really weird. But they never really got to have a full match with their opponents, Sting, the Junkyard Dog, and Michael Hayes, who was a few weeks away from joining Hiro Matsuda and turning heel. He was still very briefly a babyface here. They ran an angle where Sting, the Junkyard Dog, and Hayes were locked in a cellar or something in the basement of the arena. Kevin Sullivan plotted and had they lured them behind some kind of steel fence, and then they he put a padlock on it, and they couldn't get to the ring, and actually it was all screwed up. I remember J.J. Dillon told the story that this was right after he left, and J.J. Dillon, one of his responsibilities for the NWA, besides being a manager and stuff, is he would time out the televised shows so all the timing made sense. But once he left, they were lost. They didn't know what to do, and the timing of the show was so off, and it was a live show, so they couldn't fix it in post production. The show actually went off the air before the main event was even really finished because they screwed up. And then J.J. Dillon said that up until that point, just about, it was his responsibility to make sure that the timing of the shows was done properly. And it goes to show you, as soon as he left, this Clash of the Champions ended in very bizarre fashion. And eventually Sting, Hayes, and Junkyard Dog broke out of where they were locked in and ran to the ring and were fighting Tenryu and the Road Warriors. Yeah. Anyway, it was, but I think what happened is because Sting, Hayes, and Junkyard Dog, that's the reason Kevin Sullivan caged them in, is so he could steal the match. Since Sting, Hayes, and Dog couldn't go out, his varsity club, went out and fought the match instead, so they would have their chance at the 6-man tag team championship. That's what happened. And then Sting, Junkyard Dog, and Hayes, once they got let out of their locked predicament, ran to the ring and started brawling with everybody. It was a real mess, and it wasn't very memorable. And I guess it was just to entice people to get ready for Chi-Town Rumble 5 days later, which did prove to live up to expectations and, in fact, exceed them. But this was Clash of the Champions 5.
All right. And I guess now we might as well put a bow on this week's episode, since that's pretty much all the topics that we had for this week. Were there any other topics that we can look forward to discussing that you've been brainstorming about or geniusing about?
Well, there are, but the beauty is in the surprise. So stay tuned to our next show and you'll find out what they are.
And before we sign off, I also want to post a link in the chat as well, because I did mention Jake the Snake and Cheryl Roberts before May 30, before Jake's appearance. Uncertain if it's just Jake or if Cheryl will be there. But on Saturday, March the 28th, 2026, Jake the Snake Roberts will be alongside Cheryl Roberts doing a very special VIP meet and greet event. We are 23 days, 21 hours, and now 51 minutes and 56 seconds away. And I'm going to post a link here in the chat, because if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, I will provide you a link where it'll enable you to do so. I invite you all, if interested, to head over to collectandconnect.ca, and you can purchase a regular ticket or a VIP ticket. And there are also some options available on the website for items to get signed by both Jake and Cheryl. That is entirely up to you. So I invite each and every one of you to go to collectandconnect.ca if you are interested in attending the Jake and Cheryl Roberts meet and greet event, which will be at Mon Club Privé, in which you will be able to meet Jake and Cheryl. So if you need the address, it is 11926 Notre Dame Est, so Notre Dame East in Montreal, but it's really Pointe-aux-Trembles if you look at it.
Yeah, do you know if Damien and Lucifer will be part of this event? One or the other?
I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be any actual snakes there.
At least not the ones without 2 legs.
Well, yes. And also, I don't know when we're going to go live next, so I thought I might as well make this announcement before it's too late. So I am actually going to be in Ottawa on Sunday, March the 15th. And I will be helping my good friend of mine, Josh Gontovnik, who runs the WFM wrestling Facebook page for local wrestling collectors here. And if you want to come and see me, and if you want to pay me a visit, I will be there with Josh Gontovnik. I will be there promoting Freeform Friday, Freeform Wednesday, Monday night Freeform, Monday night Raw, Saturday night's main event, Tuesday night Titans, Sunday night Delight, whatever you want to call it. And if you're interested in being a part of the show, it's going to be at the Beyond the Pale Brewing Company, located at 250 City Center, Unit 106 in Ottawa.
Wow, that's great.
So I will be there, and there will be quite a few mutual friends of ours who will also be in attendance. So say hi, and definitely don't be shy.
Sounds like fun. So you'll be number one there.
And also, as I said at the top of the show, I do want to thank both David Reese and Michael Brandevold for giving us the time and bringing us together. And no time like the present, like I did this past Saturday, I'm going to do right now. So for those of you that are big fans of hard rock and heavy metal, I've got 2 recommendations for you that I strongly recommend you pick up. I strongly recommend you get, in any way, shape, or form, the Bangalore Choir's latest album, Rapid Fire Succession on Target Part 2. It was released via Brave Words Records, and it's a 16-track release which features a mix of hard rock, metal, AOR, and also, while you're at it, please be sure to get yourself a copy of David Reese's most recent solo album, Baptized by Fire, which was released in March of 2024.
Well, that's great, and maybe those are awesome, and maybe we'll finally get Man Mountain Rock's long-awaited hard rock album, which will be coming
Well,
out.
you mean his home video?
Well, no, I know, but I figure Man Mountain Rock. Speaking of hard rock, he needs to put out an album too. So.
Oh, he certainly does. He certainly does. So that's it for this week. I want to thank each and every one of you. Well, I don't think any of you actually tuned in, but that's okay. You can always check the replay. If you can't join us live, check it out later. Let us know what you think. Or don't. But we're going to be back, whether you guys like it or not. And remember, if you enjoy this content, be sure, if you haven't done it already, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified every time some new content is uploaded and every time we go live. Thank you as always. And as always, have yourself a great rest of the week. Take care of yourselves and each other. And we'll see you all next time.